Alright, this is Team PC's back with another Hold Paramount chapter discussion video. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 4, which is entitled Hold Paramount, also the title of the book, so we knew it was important. Now, we're going to pick out what we found were the most important topics of this chapter and talk about them a little bit.
So, to start, the chapter talks about engineering excellence. And it defines engineering excellence as basically excellent decision making. So it requires getting your client getting from your client enough information so that you can do the best job and produce the best product for your client. And also the chapter talks about how engineers are not jealous of others' success, but they value quality engineering practices from any engineer.
Right. Then the chapter goes on to talk about a little bit more of engineering ethics and how it kind of relates to the medical field and the legal field. The first part of the medical field is talking about confidentiality in engineering, and how most engineers wouldn't really consider that a major factor, although they know to hold client confidentiality up in high importance. But it starts out by talking about how it's more important in legal and medical fields than people would consider it in engineering. He goes on to talk about a little bit about suicide and then homicide a little bit, which really don't relate to engineering until you consider biomedical engineers. And it talks about how a lot of biomedical engineers have contributed different medicines and cures for people going through thoughts of suicide, or ill people who would have died if engineers hadn't come along and found a cure. It also talks about how engineers worked on the other side of it, making weapons of mass killing, such as those used in Nazi death camps and explosive chemical weapons and things like that. So it brings up the moral issue of if you're a biomedical engineer, what do you consider ethical when you're making a product, and how is that going to be used is it going to be used to benefit people, or is it going to be used to kill a lot of people?
So the chapter picks up the story of Chris and his engineering firm, Pines, and unfortunately we learned that a group of engineers from his organization have just died after a tractor trailer hits their bus and it drops off into a lake. And because of the loss of several people in their group, they are forced to reorganize teams for the current contracts that they have. And Chris inherits a project of a $50 million, 700-room, 29-story hotel, the Asmara in Philadelphia. And he learns that Pines is designing it for Timo Holdings. It's a national property company, and this hotel has just recently been finished within the last week. But as Chris goes over the designs, he finds a flaw in the overhang in front of the hotel. The overhang is modeled after the Sydney Opera House, but when he examines the designs for the overhang, he realizes that it can only withstand at most 90-mile-an-hour winds, which most people would consider that pretty good. But if a hurricane were to come through, then the overhang would be highly dangerous to anyone around, because it could easily come off. So Chris is hit with the option of, does he keep the overhang in its current state, or does he delay the building and opening in order to tear down the current overhang, redesign it, and rebuild it, even if it was not his original fault that the overhang was misdesigned by one of his coworkers. And this leads into a topic that the book discusses called factors of safety. Engineers often use these factors of safety to ensure that buildings or products, processes, materials will go above the minimum requirements in case something happens not to perform as it should. So a factor of safety of 1 means that the system meets the minimum requirements that are asked. But engineers often try to use factors of 2 or higher in order to ensure that all other factors of instability and failure are accounted for.
Perhaps one of the most important parts of this chapter is the legal and moral responsibility that an engineer has. The book raises the question of what is the ethical responsibility engineers have when they don't have legal responsibility. And the answer is fairly simple, that engineers are to hold paramount the wellness and public safety instead of maybe cutting a corner and using the cheaper alternative. And to do otherwise would be professionally unethical for the engineer. The book talks about an example in Wilmington, Delaware, of a dam that a group of engineers set out to build. The relationship between the owner and the head engineer was a little rocky at first, because the head engineer wanted to build a structurally sound dam that would ensure public safety, but the owner wanted to save money. So the story tells that the owner ended up overriding the engineer's recommendations, and he built the dam with a lower budget than the engineer recommended. So a couple of years went on, and they started to see that there were problems with the dam, and the first time that they recognized that it was unsafe, they were able to avoid a catastrophe and redraw up some designs. And then the head engineer came back and said, listen, here are the new designs that we have to do to make sure that it is safe for the public. But again, the owner ignored the recommendations, and the chief engineer just kind of washed his hands with the whole project. And it talks about in the summer of 1911, the dam ended up failing when too much water collected behind it, and it washed down into the local town and took 78 lives of the people. Instead of blaming the owner of the dam, the chief engineer took responsibility, saying that he shouldn't have just washed his hands with the project. He should have, I guess, put his foot down and said, this is what has to happen, instead of letting the owner say, we'll do the inexpensive alternative. Which shows that an engineer can't walk away from their professional responsibility because ultimately they know what to do to keep public safety and hold that paramount.
And the chapter wraps up with Chris discussing with one of his colleagues about the problem that he has discovered with the overhang of the Asmara Hotel. As he begins to talk to one of his colleagues about the structural problems with the overhang, the colleague immediately stops him, saying not to tell him anymore, because if he knows anything, he has to report it. So Chris is left with the situation: does he continue to tell and risk losing his job or problems with his boss, or does he just leave it and not worry about the possible failures of the overhang?
And that about wraps it up for Chapter 4. This is Team PCs.
I'm Josh.
I'm Justin.